Coming here today's GIC talk. My name is Kim and I'm volunteer here at GIC. Before we begin, I would like to ask you please turn off your cell phones or switch them to silent mode. Today's speaker is Weiss, who is currently English instructor at Reanalysis School in Gwangju. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees in linguistics and classical languages in University of Kansas. He is very special guest for us because since he arrived in Korea in November of 2011, he has been an active member of the community through volunteer work with the GIC, including being member of the GIC talk team. He currently co-hosts the weekly segment on GFM radio, and he has been working as a copy editor for Gwangju News magazine since May. Moreover, Bradley has also been member of archaeological excavation in Pompeii and Italy, spending his summer working there since 2007. So, how well do you know English? Perhaps many people struggle to learn English, but there is more English than just its use as a tool for communication. As we learn English, we are also exposed to the culture by English-speaking peoples. We already know that culture changes over time, such as with music and fashion, but language is another part of culture that is subject to change over time. This talk will attempt to explain some of how and why of language change, as well as to explore some of details of story of the English languages. Now let's go on journey through the history of English. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our speaker with a big round of applause.
Hi. So this is actually my second GIC talk, counting the one I gave back in March on the work that I do in the summers on the archaeological excavation in the ancient Roman city of Italy in Pompeii. As most of the regular audience members know, I'm also in front of you speaking quite often as a volunteer member of the GIC talk team. So if you are understandably growing tired of hearing the sound of my voice, please feel free to take the matter up with the GIC director, Dr. Shin, and let him know you'd like to hear and see less of me. I'll understand. So, the journey of English. Let's go on a journey. When I was younger, before I went to university, I had only vague notions about the history of the English language and little idea of the fact that languages change over time. Despite the fact that I was aware of the language preserved in the Bible and superhero comics like Thor, full of bees and thous and hats and shouts, and despite the fact that I had read some of the much different sounding English of Shakespeare, I believe my half-formed idea was something like, English comes from German. German and English actually do have a familial relationship. They're related. But it's not on the order of a parent and child, but rather that of sharing a common ancestor. They're more like cousins. But due to this shared ancestry, these two languages have a lot of similarities. Let's take a look at some of them. So you're all familiar with the English word man, and in German it's very similar. Mann. Mouse in English and Maus in German. Have and haben. Father, Vater. Guest, Gast. Good, better, best. Gut, besser, best. So the similarities, I think, are obvious to anyone. But German and English are actually not the only languages that share these similarities, but they are members of a larger language family called Germanic. And Germanic languages include modern language such as Dutch, which is one of English's closest relatives. Things like Low German, Afrikaans, which is a Germanic language spoken in South Africa, and the Scandinavian languages such as Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, as well as historical, as in no longer spoken, extinct languages like Gothic and Old Norse. So let's take a look at some of the similarities across this family. Now, I know there are some funny-looking characters in this list, and the differences are an important part of what I'm talking about today, but please also take note of the obvious similarities. These similarities are due to the fact that all of these descendant languages at some point in the past were all the same language. These all used to be one language. It's just separation over space and time has caused them to evolve differently and go on their own way, much like biological evolution. So English apple, German Apfel, Dutch Appel, Swedish, anyone speak Swedish? Okay. English book, German Buch, Dutch Buch, day, tag, dag, give, that should be geben, geben. So you can see the similarities, including snow, Schnee, etc. So if all of these languages used to be one language, then that means that English has changed or evolved over time. So there must be older, different forms of English. Indeed, I mentioned Shakespearean. Oh, sorry. So here's a schematic of the Germanic language family tree. So in the past, you had one language, something that we just call Germanic. And out of there, you have different families within the families. East Germanic, it's all dead. These only exist in writings, things like Gothic, the language of the Vandals, Burgundian, Langobardic. North Germanic, these are the Scandinavian languages. And then what's most familiar to all of us, West Germanic, of which German and English and Dutch are members. Back to the idea of English changing over time, I mentioned Shakespearean English earlier, and a Shakespearean English is an example of what scholars refer to as early modern English. So many of you, including the non-native speakers in the audience, are probably familiar with Shakespeare. But let's take a look at what we mean by early modern English with some examples from Shakespeare. Thou art dead. Anon, good nurse, speak. Dost thou know the time? Hie thee hence. Okay, I say this one a lot, but that's a joke. But yeah, so where am I? It's fairly understandable to most modern speakers of English, including the non-native speakers, accepting a few words or some strange grammar. However, we can go back further in time and we can see what's called Middle English, for which the most common example is comprised of the works of Geoffrey Chaucer from the 14th century, that is the 1300s, in somewhat confusing terminology. Many native speakers of modern English need a translation just to understand this. The language has changed that much just in 700 years. So you can see here, I am not going to attempt to pronounce these Middle English words, but you can see the modern English translation. So you see similarities, but it's kind of different, especially the way things are spelled, representing a quite different sounding language. So the furthest that we can go back within the English language is what is called Old English. The writing system might contain a few unfamiliar characters, but the sound system is largely the same. There aren't many sounds in Old English that we don't have in modern English today. However, the grammar is quite different. Let's take a look at an example from the Old English epic of Beowulf. So this is one of the oldest surviving texts in the English language. It was written down around the year 900, so more than 1,000 years ago, and was orally composed before it was written down much earlier than that. So I'll just go to the last bit here. This is from the very beginning, in the first 11 lines of Beowulf. So it's a poem, so it's written in lines. That was god kuning. That was a good king. He was a good king. So it's not that ununderstandable. So looking at these historical versions, so here we have modern English, we have Old English, we have the extinct Gothic. There's no modern ancestor of the Gothic language. We have Old Norse, so this is the ancestor of modern Norwegian, Swedish, etc. And this OHG stands for Old High German, so this is the ancestor of the modern Standard German language. So we see things like father, Vater, Fatir, Vater, three, thrice, three, drei, thou, do, other, other, honor, under. Okay, so looking at these, comparing them with one another, and comparing them over the stages of development, we can reconstruct what the original common ancestor or proto-language was like, including the sounds of the language, the vocabulary, and even some of the rules of grammar and syntax. And syntax is the rules that tell you how you can put together words to make sentences. This linguistic approach is known as the comparative method. So, so here we go. So this is comparing some of the forms as we just did. And from this, going through things like this, people can reconstruct the common Germanic proto-forms of the language. So we've shown how using the comparative method, we can reconstruct the history of English back before it was English to its Germanic roots. But is it possible to extend this idea further backwards than the stage we call Proto-Germanic? In case you're wondering, the answer is yes. In the 18th century, that is the 1700s, European scholars noticed some striking similarities between the historical languages of Europe and India. Pursuing this, utilizing the comparative method we just discussed, modern scholars constructed the Indo-European hypothesis. This basically involves the idea that most all of the languages of Europe, with a few exceptions such as the isolated language of Basque in Spain, and Finnish and Hungarian, and many of the languages of northern India, including Hindi, those of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as parts of the Middle East, such as Iran, including the Persian language, and parts of Central Asia, all of these languages have one common ancestor. So just like all of the Germanic languages used to be one language, all of these languages in Europe and parts of the Middle East and South Asia, they all used to be one language. So here you see the Sanskrit forms compared to the English, Latin, and Greek. Just like the Proto-Germanic was able to be reconstructed, a Proto-Indo-European language, or at least elements of it, can and has been reconstructed now for hundreds of years by scholars. So like I said, this Proto-Indo-European hypothesis goes back to the 18th century, some 300 years ago. The time depth of a common Germanic ancestor is only going back about 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. But when one looks at the differences between these modern languages, even a casual glance by a non-specialist can determine there are more significant differences between these member languages of the Indo-European language family tree, and that's impossible to read. Sorry about that. But you have an original language, Proto-European, that spawned things like Greek and Sanskrit, which gave birth to Hindi and the languages in many of the languages in northern Italy, Iranian, which gave birth to Persian, Slavic, so modern Russian, Ukrainian. You have the Germanic family tree, which we've already discussed, Latin, which gave birth to all the Romance languages, and the Celtic branch, which gave birth to things like Irish Gaelic and some other things. And you know that these are very different types of languages, and that's because these languages separated and started going their own way and evolving a very, very long time ago. So I'm not here to give a specialized lecture on linguistic methodology and theory, but keep in mind that when you're applying the comparative method to determine these relationships, it's not just a matter of, hey, these two words from these two different languages kind of look similar. Rather, it's about regular correspondences between languages. So whenever language 1 has sound X in a certain place, language 2 will always have sound Y. I hope that makes sense. It's a very simplified version of kind of a difficult concept. But I don't want to spend too much time on the far distant proto-language, Proto-Indo-European, but I only wanted to introduce the idea so that you can understand how far back that time depth really is when one starts talking about the history of the English language. Now, to return briefly to the Germanic stage of English, let's identify some common characteristics of Germanic languages. And some of these common features result in things that are often called irregular forms. But as in any language, most any irregular form is likely the result of a process that was regular or systematic at some point. You just have to look back far enough. So two of these features are called Ablaut and Umlaut. So let's look at Germanic Ablaut. Ablaut is just a term to describe a system of vowel alternations. So everyone that learns English has to learn things like ring, rang, rung, swim, swam, swum, sing, sang, sung, but this Ablaut system also includes song in this pattern. You're just changing the vowel and the stem. The vowel patterns were systematized in the verbs of the Germanic languages into different classes, and we can see this down here in the corresponding English and German. Begin, began, begun, beginnen, begun, begonnen. Ablaut goes beyond just verb paradigms, however, and we can see this system of Ablaut is evident in a list of nouns that have a similar meaning but a slight variation, such as this STR vowel P sequence. These are all nouns in English which all mean something long and thin, but not all the exact same thing. Strip, strap, stripe, strop. Let's keep going. Umlaut is basically just a process where one sound in a word or across words becomes more like another sound. This is because your mouth wants to make sequences of sounds as easy to pronounce as possible. So really different sounds, when they come close together, become more similar. I thought I would include a couple of Korean examples to give you an idea of what this is like. 감사합니다. It's not 합니다 because the influence of this N sound makes the B sound turn into an So this is a type of what linguists would call umlaut. But umlaut proper in English and other Germanic languages doesn't affect consonants. it affects vowels. So without going into too much detail on the technicals of how things are articulated, basically when a suffix is added to a word where the vowel is farther forward and where it's pronounced in the mouth, it pulls the pronunciation of the vowel that comes before it forward. So German man, which have two N's, man but Männer, and Fuß but Füße. This is man and foot. I didn't include the translations. We'll revisit umlaut in a little while when it interacts with another change in the history of the English language to produce what seem to be irregularities in the modern language. One of the most important, finally a picture. Thank you, Bradley, something to look at. One of the most important historical events that had an impact on the English language was the Norman conquest of England in 1066 by French-speaking Normans. So the Normans were literally Northmen. They were descendants of Vikings who had led incursions into France a century earlier, but decided to stay, settle the land, and adopt the language and customs of their new French-speaking neighbors. So these were Scandinavian language-speaking Vikings who came to France, started speaking French, and became French. And this area is known as Normandy, which is probably familiar to many as the landing site of the D-Day invasion of the Allied forces in World War II. Before he received an upgrade in name to William the Conqueror, there was a Norman in Normandy known as William the Bastard. He had a tenuous claim to the throne of England at a time when the throne of England was kind of up for grabs. He led a force of French-speaking Normans to England and defeated the last other people who were trying to claim the throne of England at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And this is a famous tapestry called the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts this battle, the Battle of Hastings. So in the ensuing period following that, the ruling class of England were French speakers. So this led to a massive influx of French-based Romance vocabulary into English, and an almost hybrid English resulted, at least in terms of vocabulary, that's different from its other Germanic cousins. But the fundamental building blocks of language remain unchanged. So basic vocabulary like pronouns, I, he, we, these things are not from French, these are Germanic. They remained unchanged, as well as syntax. But this did lead to a certain prestige for French words in English that still exists to this day. It's evident in the way we can choose a native English word for something or the French-based borrowing, and the French always somehow sounds better, right? Or fancier. If we want to impress somebody, we don't say, I'm going to eat cow. We say, I'm going to eat beef, because that's better. Or, I'm not going to eat deer, I'm going to eat venison. Ah, yeah, that sounds much nicer, because it's French. The one fortunate side effect of this is that it's made the English vocabulary far more Romance language based. Maybe that's not, it depends on how you want to view it, as to whether it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that the native speakers of modern English, had this not happened today, would be able to look at a language like Dutch and basically be able to read it. Maybe not speak it or understand the grammar, but you could more or less figure out what it says. But the one nice thing about this is that it's given us a lot of shared vocabulary with Romance languages. So when native English speakers go to learn French or Spanish or Italian or even Latin, like I did myself, it's much easier in terms of vocabulary. The vocabulary looks similar. I'd like to draw a quick parallel here to, it's not exactly the same situation, but at this time period, the status of French in England, a native English-speaking country, was kind of similar to the status of English here in Korea. So you see a lot of signs in English, or businesses are given English names, because English has a certain prestige here, but English is in no way taking over Korean. The Korean language will always maintain its Koreanness, and English has likewise maintained the fundamentals of what it makes it English. So, one major way that English has changed, as we just discussed, is through the adoption of large amounts of non-native vocabulary. So what are some of the other ways a language can change? I will provide just a few brief, hopefully more interesting than the previous parts, examples of the kinds of processes that can affect a language. One of these processes is semantic amelioration or pejoration. Basically, this is the process in which the value or meaning associated with the word either becomes significantly better or worse. Amelioration means it becomes better. Pejoration means it becomes worse. So an example of semantic, and semantic just means what a word means. Semantic amelioration can be seen in the Old English knecht, which just meant a boy, a youth, a servant. But this is modern English knight, okay? So, this is a significant amelioration or bettering of the word. It came about through its use as meaning a military follower, and until its status was eventually raised to that which is familiar today, where it's often followed by words like in shining armor. It doesn't mean youth or boy anymore. On the flip side of that are words like awful. Poor awful. Awful originally just literally meant full of awe or inspiring wonder or fear. But today it's come to mean really bad. No one wants to hear, that's an awful song. You won't interpret that as, oh, it inspired wonder in you. No, that's an insult. Your singing is awful. Another example, in common usage today, egregious, maybe, oh, I didn't put the modern English spelling is the same as the Latin, only there's an O between I and U, egregious. Egregious is one of those romance-based words that has worked its way into the English vocabulary, but being nearly identical to its Latin ancestor, egregius, it's near and dear to my heart. I like this word. The greg part of the word is the word for a flock or a herd, the term for a group of animals like sheep or goats. And the part at the beginning of it is ex, the familiar prefix, which means out of or away from. So originally in Latin, this word egregius meant something stood out from the flock. Literally like the English word outstanding. That's outstanding. That's really good. In a good way. But in usage today, egregious means something that is remarkably bad. So these are two examples of semantic pejoration, how the meaning of a word can become worse, and one example of amelioration, how it can become better. And there are many other processes that can affect what a word means, including a broadening or a narrowing of a meaning. English has the word hound, which refers to a very specific type of dog. And that's obviously the same word as German Hund, which is just the word for dog, any dog. So you can see that that has had a narrowing or broadening of its meaning in the respective languages. But I don't have the time or audience's interest to go through an exhaustive list of all of these types of processes. One other interesting thing that can happen to words in a language, particularly in a setting in which most of the speakers of a language are illiterate and only exposed to the language through how they hear it. And that's been the case almost everywhere through almost all of human history. And this process is called reanalysis. This is where speakers reorganize the string of sounds that they hear in their mind to something slightly different than the original. These examples should illustrate what I mean. One way in which this can happen is when one part of a compound word goes out of use. It leaves the speakers struggling to make sense of the pieces. Old English had a word for man that was guma. This is related to the Latin-based human. So Old English guma and Latin humanus are related, and this just means man. So there's a compound involving this word that's bride guma. And this signified the man that was married to a bride or a woman at a wedding. However, eventually English lost guma, but we retained the compound form, bride guma. Speakers were puzzled over to what bride guma was composed of. People knew the word groom, however. It's a person who's with something, like a horse groom is the man who's there with the horse. So they said, bride guma, do you mean bridegroom? Yeah, I think that's what you mean. So this is an example of reanalysis, in which change over time obscures the original meaning, and so the speakers change it to, they reanalyze it to make sense of it. Another way that this reanalysis can occur is when people aren't sure where to make divisions in the string of sounds. Everyone here knows that English has two different forms of the indefinite article, a or un, depending on if the following word begins with a vowel. And we can see examples of this exact same kind of allomorphy in Korean. Allomorphy is the big term. With the object marker or depending on whether the preceding sound has a vowel at the end. Now this led to confusion for several words through the history of English. The word apron was originally napron, and it's that nip is related to the nap in napkin. So originally we had napron, and then people heard unapron, 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 and they thought they were hearing unapron, and so the word that was originally napron became apron. And something similar happened in the history of the word orange. Spanish, now this word comes into European languages through Arabic, but Spanish, you can see naranja, maintains that original N, but the mistake was made before it got to English, where we lost the N as it traveled its way through languages. And so where Spanish has naranja, English has orange. The same process, but in reverse, is evident in the word nickname. If some of the non-native speakers aren't familiar with this word, a nickname is someone's other name, another name for someone. So in Old English, eka means also or additional, and this is the same word as German auch, which means also. So an eka name is someone's other name, then another name for this person, but it got reinterpreted as being, instead of the in getting chopped off, the in actually moves on to the word, and an eka name becomes a nika name, which gives us the modern English nickname. I mentioned earlier that this particular type of change is especially liable to happen in a pre-literate environment. But we can see almost the exact same thing at work in English today, a literate society, where you have other and another, but there's technically no nother in English. However, I'm sure many of the native speakers in attendance today have either heard or, more likely, even caught themselves saying the phrase, a whole nother thing. I know I definitely say this. How much more do I want to talk about technical stuff? There was basically something called the Great Vowel Shift in English, in which all of the vowels shifted up. This is basically a chart that shows where vowels are produced in your mouth, where your tongue is positioned This is the front of your mouth, this is the back of your mouth, this is the top, this is the bottom. And this is phonetic alphabet, so these sounds are E, A, Ah, and Oo, O, Ah. Okay? And between the 14th and 18th centuries, English underwent a change in which all of these vowels moved up, and the things that were at the top became diphthongs. So that accounts for the differences between how English is pronounced with the same Roman alphabet as many other languages in Europe. So if you're familiar with any other European languages, you know that this vowel is usually pronounced E, not I. This vowel is usually pronounced A, not E. And everything has shifted up. And we can talk about why that is. If you're dying to know in person, come talk to me later. But I won't go through with every moment that. But the more interesting thing about this great vowel shift is that it acted together with the process we talked about earlier called umlaut. So the great vowel shift plus umlaut helped produce some of the irregular nouns we have today. So in the Proto-Germanic period, these are the words for mouse, mice, foot, feet. So you had something like moose, muses, and fots, fotis. And the umlaut process caused these vowels to change because of adding something at the end. The vowel became more like the following vowel. That's what umlaut is. So you end up, by the Old English period, moose, moose, and foat, fate. And then, after the great vowel shift happens, you go from moose, meese, to the now familiar mouse, mice, and from foot, fate, to foot, feet. So that's quite a bit of information about the history of English. But the description of this talk promised some discussion concerning the present and future of English as well. What about those topics? No one said. I think that many of you in the audience are familiar with the concept of dialects. One further concept I would like to introduce involves how to think about, how to conceptualize dialects. These don't exist in some kind of walled-off fortress where you can draw a definitive line on a map and say, on one side of the line, people say this, and it's this dialect. And on the other side of the line, people say that, and it's another dialect. Rather, linguists look at something, the reality is not so simple and easy to grasp, but the reality is closer to what linguists refer to as dialect chains. So in a dialect chain, A can understand B just fine, and B can understand C just fine, and you can extend this way out. So A and B and C and D and G, all of these neighboring dialects. Everyone understands their neighbor, and maybe their neighbor's neighbor, but when you get far enough apart, people stop being able to understand each other. Even though along the chain, everyone can understand the people nearest to them. So that's when dialects start diverging and becoming different languages given a certain distance apart, usually physical distance. So what kind of criteria do we use to establish divisions between these various dialects? One of them is based on lexicon, or vocabulary. The differences between, say, British English and American English vocabulary are well known. Things like Americans say truck, British say lorry, Americans say elevator, British say lift, etc., etc. However, those differences don't involve neighboring dialects, physically neighboring dialects. One well-known example I can include from American English involves the way people refer to or order a soft drink in the US. And the debate between which is the right way to do this can become quite heated. I grew up referring to soft drinks as soda because both of my parents, who are in attendance today, both come from this little pocket right here. This is where I'm from, but both of my parents are from here. So you can see these are in different areas of how this is referred to. This is a soda pocket. This is where people say soda. This is where people say soda, but all this blue area is where people say pop. People who said soda where I was raised, in Kansas, were marked as different and almost somehow wrong. So in addition to other elements of the language that I changed from the way my parents speak to fit in with my peers, I changed from calling these drinks pop. I changed to calling these drinks pop instead of soda. However, in the United States, there exists a third alternative, primarily in the southern states, including states such as Texas, where people are inclined to do things their own way anyway. English speakers utilize a rather common strategy of referring to a generic product by the iconic brand name of that particular product. English speakers do this all the time. I don't ever ask for a bandage. I will ask for a Band-Aid. I would never order gelatin. I would order Jell-O. I would never ask for, well, maybe I might ask for a tissue, especially here, after having been here in Korea, where that word has been borrowed as tissue, but most of the time back at home, I would just ask for a Kleenex. These are all brand names. So people in Texas and the surrounding area, in the area of the surrounding states, have adopted the practice of referring to all soft drinks as Coke. So in the southern states, it's entirely normal to hear something like the following exchange. I'd like a cheeseburger, fries, and a large Coke. What kind of Coke would you like? I'd like a Mountain Dew. Okay. That was a terrible attempt at a southern accent. I apologize to any proud southerners in attendance. Let's talk about the last element of this talk, the future of the English language. We've already established that language has changed constantly. There's no such thing as a static language, a language that isn't changing. I will use one case in point to discuss the current state of change in American English. I mentioned the great vowel shift of English that took place between the 14th and 18th centuries. In North America, the evidence suggests that we are currently undergoing a very similar change. It's referred to as the Great Lakes shift or the Northern Cities shift. Here are the Great Lakes, for those of you who might not know. And so obviously these are north, so Northern Cities or Great Lakes shift, because it's started happening in cities that ring the Great Lakes. Linguists first noticed aspects of this change in the late 1960s. Basically, I won't go into much detail about this, but if you look at the words like bat, bet, bit, bot, but, all five of those words are B, vowel, T. And their long vowel equivalents would be bait, beat, bite, boat, boot, and bout. And they arrived at this modern pronunciation as a result of the great vowel shift that I discussed before that began almost 700 years ago. And these short vowels, the short version of the vowels, have remained pretty much the same since for a long time. The short version, the long versions of the vowels changed in the Great Vowel Shift, but the short versions of the vowels have remained constant for almost 1,000 years. But what's going on now is that many speakers of this Northern Cities shift it's starting with the short A, so that in a word like cat, the sound, it's almost taking on a second syllable. The A sound almost begins to resemble the word yeah, cat, or the final two syllables in the word idea. So what this is setting off is something like a game of musical chairs with the vowel sounds, where they're pushing into each other. In an article I read about this process, you might hear someone refer to the bosses with the antennas on the tap, and not know what they're talking about until you realize that he's talking about the buses that have the antennas on top. So bosses instead of buses, and tap instead of top. And with this dialect, and it appears that this dialect is growing, it's spreading. You never know what will happen with a language in the future, but this has been spreading since the 1960s. So I hope that in this talk, I have given you all a better understanding about how languages change over time, and specifically the kinds of changes that have happened to English in the past, something about its present state, and the current differences, and some ideas about where it might be headed in the future. I appreciate your listening.